Hi, this is Marcus with Recon Power Bikes, and today in this video I'm going to show you how to assemble your new Recon Power Bike Sortie. When your Sortie shows up in the mail, the first thing you're going to do is inspect the box. Make sure there's no damages on the outside. Everything looks good. And once it passes that inspection, go ahead and grab some snips and cut the bands. Once the bands are cut off, toss them to the side. And now you're able to open the box. Inside the box, there's going to be a few things you're going to want to take note on. Now that the box is open, take out the foam. Set that aside. You're going to find a parts box. This is going to include your pedals, your other hardware for additional parts on the bike. Set those aside. Your battery. And now it's time to lift it. A couple ways to do that is you can actually tilt the box on its side and pull the bike out. I do highly recommend if you have somebody to help you, that is going to make it the easiest way to get the bike out of the box. All right, we're going to go ahead and pop this out. Once the Sortie's out of the box, there is one more part that's in there, and it is the front rack. So don't miss that before you dispose of the actual box itself. Now we're going to go through, cut off all the zip ties, which will then free the front wheel. Then we're going to remove all the bubble wrap and any of the foam that's on the bike to help protect from any damage in the shipment. Go ahead and take your snips. Start cutting away the zip ties. It's very important not to actually hit one of the cables. So we have brake cables, shifter cables. Just be aware when you are making your cuts that you're cutting zip ties and not the housing or cable. Now once those are cut, remove your front wheel, set it to the side. Go ahead and cut the other zip ties, which removes the handlebars. And then once all the zip ties are cut, go ahead and start removing all the foam and bubble wrap. One of the nice things when purchasing the Sortie is it really doesn't require many tools to complete the assembly. So really, 5 different tools. You've got a 5mm, 4mm, and 3mm hex wrench, and a 15 and 10mm open-ended wrench. So before we really start the assembly process, let's take a look inside the parts box that you removed from the box before pulling out the bike. So a little closer, you've got the pedals, front light, the hardware to add on the additional accessories, the power cord, as well as the charger itself. Go ahead and remove those from the box and toss the box to the side. First thing that we're going to do for the assembly of this Sortie is take the faceplate off of the stem. I do want to actually point out though, sometimes when receiving our bike, you're going to notice the stem might be flipped in the other direction. Now it's very important when we install the handlebars that the stem is actually in this finishing position. We will make our fine-tune adjustments once the handlebars are on and we get the front wheel on and we kind of make sure that the handlebars in the proper spot. But for now, what you're going to do is take your 4mm hex wrench, go ahead and loosen the bolts. And once the bolts are all out, you can remove the faceplate. Now that the faceplate is off of the stem, let's grab the handlebars. Let's set them in the stem. I want you to notice there's actually grooves on this handlebar. Now those grooves allow to have a little bit more snugness on the faceplate when you actually mount it to the stem itself. Let's be sure that that's center when you put the faceplate on. Doesn't have to be perfect right away while you're installing the faceplate, but once you get all the bolts in and before tightening down to the proper torque spec, we'll make sure that the handlebars are in a nice neutral and equal position. Go ahead and take your 4mm, and start to put the bolts in. Now that the faceplate is on, this is where we're going to make sure that the handlebar is in a very neutral and equal position, and the grooves on the handlebar itself are not being shown on either side of the faceplate. Once it looks good, we're going to tighten it down just a little bit more, and you're not going to make your fine-tune adjustments until the front wheel is on, and then we're really going to worry about the handlebar position as well as your display, your grips, and your brake levers. Be sure when you're tightening the faceplate, you're tightening in an equal and not going too tight on the top and not as tight on the bottom. That can cause an inconsistency of the actual tension itself, and your handlebars can move while you're riding. So be sure to apply equal amounts of torque on each bolt. Now that we have the handlebars in a position to where we can move on to the next step of the assembly, we're going to actually put on the fender. Let's be sure we have all the parts and the hardware for the fender. So we have the fender itself. And this is where we're going to install the front light as well. Go ahead and grab the hardware, which is a long bolt, 2 washers, and then a nut. So what we'll do is go ahead and put the fender in place here. Go ahead and slide that long bolt in. And on the back side of this fork bridge, we're going to put that light here. Now it can be a little tight, but it should find its way through the hole. Go ahead and add that washer on the back and fasten it down with the 10mm nut. Now this is where you're going to take your 5mm wrench and your 10mm open-ended wrench. And go ahead and tighten down. Now I want to be sure to let you know, try not to over torque this. What can happen is the actual plastic on the light can break. So we need to get it snug enough to where the fender is in place and then the light doesn't really move side to side unless you forcefully push it. But again, we will make all of our fine-tune adjustments once all the parts are on the bike itself. Okay. Now we're fine-tuning that fine little bit of torque. After this is fastened down, we'll go ahead and plug in the front light. Okay. Now we're going to be sure to make sure and match up the arrows on the male and female end of this plug. So everything looks good. We don't want to damage any of the prongs to the point where they actually don't mate together, because what can happen is your front light won't work. If you do, however, run into that situation, just go ahead and give us an email at info@reconpowerbikes.com. Now that the fender is installed, as well as the headlight, let's be sure that before we put the front wheel on, that we double check and make sure that your bike does not have one of these. This is a brake block, and it can be found in the caliper itself, which is right here. Now, some of our models do have hydraulic disc brakes, which does require, in shipment, one of these blocks. However, this one is mechanical, so there is a cable actually pulling the brake pads together when you pull the brake lever. So, and that, I just wanted to point it out before we put the front wheel on. All right. So one of the things that we can do is make sure and grab the front of the bike and go ahead and line up the front wheel. Now, once you do that, make sure that the rotor slides nice into the caliper and that your washers are on the outside of the dropouts. And when we fasten the nuts, go ahead and do it equally so the wheel will not be pulled to one side or the other. Now that you have the front wheel on, go ahead and take your 15mm open-ended wrench and tighten down until you have the proper torque on the front wheel. And all torque specs can be found in the owner's manual. All right, now that those are fastened, we'll move on to the next step. So let's move on to the front basket. So you're going to see 4 bolts on the front of the actual head tube of the bike itself. Go ahead and take a 4mm hex wrench and start to loosen these bolts. Prior to installing the front rack, these 4 bolts will need to be totally removed. With the bolts being totally removed from the frame itself, go ahead and grab your front rack, slide your cables to the right, and now install your 4 bolts back into the frame to support the rack. Once your front rack is installed, go ahead and grab your 4mm hex wrench, and let's adjust the handlebars to the proper position. Go ahead and loosen the faceplate. I want to point out again, make sure you're doing equal on all bolts. Don't try to loosen the top all the way out and leave the bottom in. We want an equal amount of pressure on the faceplate and the actual handlebar once we tighten everything back up. All right, so now that we can rotate it, go ahead and rotate the bar forward. And one thing you'll notice is our handlebars have an up sweep and a back sweep. We want to be sure that these handlebars are in a good position where the up sweep isn't going this way or towards the rider. It is pointing directly up, and your back sweep isn't to the point where it's rotating all the way down. Now, to give you a side shot of what the back sweep looks like, we already talked about the up sweep, that little notch here pointing in the upward position. Now the back, as I rotate the bars, you'll notice that this grip will actually move up or start to move down. We want it in a very neutral position. So right there. And a lot of times handlebars, this is a recommendation of ours. However, it can be personal preference, because once we actually get the handlebar into the spot that we prefer, what's important is how the grips are in position, as well as the shifter and brake levers. Now that the handlebar is in the position that the rider does prefer, let's go ahead and adjust the shifter as well as the brake lever. And what we're going to need is the 5mm hex wrench. So go ahead and take that 5. Let's loosen the bolt for the shifter. And for now, let's slide that out of the way. So what we're going to do is actually position the brake lever in a 45-degree angle. Go ahead and take the same 5mm, and on the back side, there is a bolt that holds the brake lever to the handlebar. Now let's loosen that to the point where we can actually move the brake lever freely and get it into that position. All right, so once we get the brake lever in a position that is about 45, I do want to give a little bit of a space between the brake lever itself and the grip. So go ahead and slide that just a tad. And actually, you can take your 5mm hex, and the space between the grip and the brake lever is about ideal with that 5mm. So go ahead and tighten on the back side. And again, we will torque these down after we get everything in the right position. Let's go ahead and slide that shifter back over. And now this is going to be another spot of preference. So when you have your hand on the handlebar, you want to make sure that the shifter is in a position where your index finger and your thumb can comfortably shift while riding. Once it's in that desired position, go ahead and take your 5mm hex wrench and tighten it back down. Now that your brake lever is in a position that's about 45 degrees when holding onto the handlebar itself, let's get the shifter in a position that feels comfortable for the rider. Now this is a preference thing. However, we do want to have that shifter pretty close to the brake lever, a little bit of a gap. And now it really comes down to the fine tune. When you put it in the position that you're in, make sure that your index finger and your thumb can shift the actual shifter itself without any obstruction. Once you feel like that's in a good position for yourself, go ahead and take your 5mm hex and fasten that back down. Now that the right side of the handlebar controls are actually in the desired position, let's do the same thing on the left. So go ahead and take your 5mm hex wrench. Repeat the steps you did with the brake lever that was on the right side for the left. Loosen. 45-degree position. Go ahead and take the 5, tighten it down. And now, once you're done with that, you'll take your 3mm hex wrench. Go ahead and loosen your throttle. And get into a position where the tab for the throttle is slightly up, not catching on the control buttons, but also not hitting the bell itself. We want to be sure that the bell, nothing is up against it, so when we do ring it, you can actually hear it. Now that the throttle's in that good spot, let's tighten it down. Earlier in the video, we talked about the placement of the stem. Now we're at that part of the video where we can customize how the stem's going to be on the bicycle. So we're going to fine tune these adjustments by making sure that the stem cap bolt is tight. And it's very important that this is tight because it actually holds the front suspension or fork together inside of your head tube of the bike to make sure that doesn't pop off while you're riding. So take your 5mm. Go ahead, try not to over tighten it, but make sure it's nice and snug. Now, if you notice that your handlebars are a little cockeyed in a different position, you can loosen your stem pinch bolts. Do this equally. And now you can go in and fine tune the actual handlebar itself. Once you have in the desired position, everything looks straight, take your 5mm and equally torque down the pinch bolts. Be sure not to over torque. You can round these bolts off, which would prevent you from torquing them down to the actual required spec. If you have any questions about the torque specs, please refer to the owner's manual. It'll tell exactly where these need to be torqued. So now that everything looks good on the front end, let's go ahead and install the pedals. So the pedals themselves are going to have a couple indicators which will say which one's the right and which one's the left. You'll find that on the inside of the actual pedal spindle. So before we install, it's very important to apply a little bit of grease onto the threads themselves. What that does is helps prevent seizing over time. That's the worst thing that can happen is you've been riding this bike for a year, you want to actually upgrade or change the pedals, but you can't get them off because the pedal itself is seized into the crank arm. But now that we've applied a little bit of grease, go ahead and insert. And now pedals, the right side will actually tighten like normal, righty-tighty. And once we get to the point where it's actually snugged up against the crank arm, take your 15mm open-ended wrench and go ahead and again, snug it up. But once everything's finally done, we'll go through and retorque it to make sure everything's nice and tight. Now that the right pedal's installed, let's install the left. Go ahead and apply that grease to the threads. And now the biggest difference here is the left pedal actually tightens the opposite way. So instead of tightening the right clockwise, you'll actually tighten the left counterclockwise. So now just like the right, once the pedal spindle is up against the crank arm, go ahead and take your 15mm open-ended wrench and go ahead and tighten that down. All right, pedals are on. Now we need to apply some grease into the seat post. This bike itself, the seat was already installed. But like the pedals and the crank arms, we want to apply a little bit of grease so we can prevent seizing over time. Go ahead and take the same grease, apply a little bit to the post itself, and go ahead and insert that back in to the frame. Rotate the actual seat and seat post, and go ahead and fasten down your quick release lever. So one thing I want to point out is the quick release lever for the seat itself. So when you actually you don't want it to be so loose and easy to close. What can happen is when you hit a bump or you're riding, the seat itself can actually get slammed down to the frame and or start to shift side to side and be very uncomfortable on your ride. So one thing you can do is go ahead and open it up, and on the opposite side of the lever, there is a nut. Go ahead and fasten that down and or hold it. Give it one good rotation while holding the nut, and now it should be nice and tight. Since we're on the topic of the seat post and the seat, I do want to talk one thing about seat height. Now, a lot of times people feel comfortable with the seat being low enough where both of your feet are flat on the ground. And that's okay. If that's what your preference is, you can definitely do that. However, when doing longer rides, one thing we want to make sure is we prevent fatigue within the legs or the knees themselves. And one quick thing that you can do to make sure that the seat is in the right height is when you hop on, if you're sitting flat-footed and you take your heel and actually set it on the pedal while the pedal's at the bottom of the stroke, you want to make sure that your leg is actually totally straight. What that'll help do is get you in a position to where your knees aren't going to be as fatigued or tired in the duration of your ride. So that was pretty bent there. We'll go ahead and loosen the seat. And now it's quite a bit straighter. This bike is a little small for me. However, if it was the right size, I'd be sure to raise that seat up a bit more so I can get it straighter. But again, now if I'm in the right riding position at the bottom, my knees aren't totally bent and I have a little bit more straightness on the leg itself. So it's going to be less fatigue in the longer part of the ride. Time for the battery. So the battery looks like this. You'll find your keys hanging on the handlebar themselves. So one thing we want to make sure when putting in the battery, you go ahead and put the bottom part in first and go ahead and push down. Make sure the battery's in there nice and tight, and let's power on the bike. All right, now that the battery's installed inside the bike, let's go ahead and turn on the display. So you're going to find on the control button pad, there are 3 different buttons. The one which we're going to push to power on the display is the middle one. Now that the display is on, I want to point out a few things on the display itself. You have the amount of battery left, your odometer on the top right, your speed in the middle, also the mode on the bottom left, and then you're going to notice here on the bottom right, the amount of watts that your bike uses to propel you forward. To change the actual amount of assistance that you're going to get out of the bicycle, you'll toggle through on the control buttons, the up or down arrows to change the level of assistance. 5 is the highest, which will propel you the fastest. And 1 is going to be the lowest amount of power, however, may give you the longest duration of the ride with assistance. To power on the front light, go ahead and hold down the up arrow for a few seconds, and you'll notice on the bottom left, the light icon will show up. Once you want to turn that off, you can hold that arrow again, it will turn off. To power down the display, hold that middle button again, and the display will turn off. So let's talk about the tires. So the tires themselves may have some air in there. Most of the time, they're pretty flat. So we'll be sure to put some air in before our first ride. The type of valve that our bicycles have is a Schrader valve. It's the same valve that you're going to find on your vehicle. So what you'll do is unthread the valve cap, take your pump, place it on the valve cap itself, and inflate these tires to a max of 30 psi. Now, the PSI is rider preference. So riding on hard surfaces, typically that 25 to 30 PSI is going to be something you'll want to ride on. However, gravel or dirt or any other terrain that isn't as hard as the pavement, try to go anywhere from 15 to 25 PSI. Now that you've successfully assembled your Recon Sortie, it is super important to go through each part of the bike to make sure all the hardware is torqued to spec. Refer to the owner's manual and make sure you grab the proper tools to torque down so you have no malfunctions on your first ride. However, if there is any issues that you do have, or you're not confident in one area, your brakes rubbing, or you're having another issue that you just can't make sense of, feel free to refer to the videos that we have on our channel.